Welcome. This is Distant Torments, from inner space to outer space. This is a series of short stories on the intersection of sci-fi, horror, and politics. Food scarcity, the thinning of what was once abundant, induces heart anxiety, a dreadful nervous chitter deep in your stomach. Only dark and painless sleep can bring momentary sweet respite. In 2070, after a continuous decade of global wildfires destroying crops and the mismanagement of resources by faulty governments, I began working in the lab, 12 hours each day, on genetically altering Digitaria sanguinalis, or as it's commonly referred to, crabgrass, a common weed. The crabgrass would sprout quickly in dry, burnt fields and parched pavements. It needed a little water and would grow under the worst conditions. Imagine waking up one morning hungry and having no food to eat. Your cabinets would be bare except for a stray strand of pasta and hungry, emaciated mice scrunched in the dark corners. Imagine going to the stores and having all the shelves bare. There might be a rotten apple, a hunk of cheese growing mold, or random piles of dented tuna cans long past their expiration date. The first day of hunger is easy. The second day, a struggle. And the third day, a primal panic forces you to wander Earth's wastelands in search of anything to eat. I saw a woman, probably middle-aged, but ravaged by the sun and lack of nutrition. On her hands and knees, stuffing weeds into her mouth where only a few teeth remained. She chewed, swallowed, and then vomited. She laid down in the field and cried, plaintive and piercing. In my lab, I began the Project Savior, of genetically modifying weeds to be nutritious and appetizing. I had two assistants, Dr. Rantana of Thailand, a botanist, and Dr. Moreau from France, a biologist, who had worked for companies like McDonald's and Subway by developing additives to make their food taste better than it was. He had learned to make the unhealthiest food taste like a sumptuous meal at a high-end resort restaurant. When the food crisis hit, I fled to a mountain family home in Oregon, where I could hunt animals and grow my food. I had an expensive camouflage net over the breadth of my garden to prevent people, via satellite, drone, or threading through the mountains seeking nourishment, from finding my rich soil and rich harvests. I set up a biolab in the barn, and behind the barn I tilled soil to grow experimental plant weeds. It took 3 months to create the new weeds that I called Saturnia Savior, a derivation of Saturn, the loveliest planet in the solar system. I should have done more testing. In hindsight, it should have happened. But when the world is starving and you have a potential solution, you don't stay in your lab for years working out the kinks of your genetic engineering. I took the weed to the government, the President of the United States. His staff laid a place setting for him at his desk, and I placed on a gleaming white plate thick curling weeds. He hesitated before eating. I knew most people worldwide would be hesitant, but he ate, slowly crunching, and then smiled. It tastes like prime rib, said the president. Do you have any other flavors? I cleared my throat. Yes, blueberry pie and baked potato with cheese. I'm working on other flavors. The president smiled. Is it nutritious? He asked. I nodded. It's as nutritious as swallowing a multivitamin. All the people surrounding the president clapped. After that, the government took over the planting, harvesting, and distributing of the weeds. Other countries wanted the weeds, but the government only gave weeds to politically friendly countries. It didn't matter. The seeds began to float in the air and drift on the sea currents, and soon every country was growing weeds. Corporations tried to control access to the weeds, except the weeds began to grow in parks, backyards, gardens, and cracks in the street. Saturninia's savior was everywhere. The world population increased and governments made killing weeds of any variety illegal until cities were overgrown with the creeping green blades. The weeds were resistant to pesticides, and if you chopped them down or pulled them up by their roots, they grew back the next day. Earth had become a global garden for weeds. I stayed in my home in the mountains and watched as weeds blanketed the slopes, crests, and valleys. Soon my garden would grow only weeds. Tomatoes, carrots, lettuce were crowded out by the fiend I had created. On a deep night, darkened by the tall stalks of the weeds, I heard a frightening whispering sound, like a cackling, malevolent ghost. I turned on the bedroom light and screamed. Weeds were curled around my bedpost, winding across the windows, carpeting the wood floor, making my home their home. I walked out into the hall, covered by the weeds, and knocked on Dr. Ratana's door. I heard a strange sound, a muffled crying. I opened the door. She was in bed with weeds winding around her body and covering her mouth. The weeds lifted her and moved her in a swaying motion. She was being suffocated. I tried to pull off the weeds, but it made my hands bloody. I couldn't get the weeds to budge. Dr. Antana became silent and stopped struggling. The weeds had murdered her. I went to my lab, overgrown with weeds, and wondered, when would I be next? When would the weeds kill me and finish destroying the earth? Undulating in the dark, the weeds grew taller and taller until the moon was blotted out, and laughter emerged from the soil. I was their creator, their mother, who engineered them, and they would never let me escape their green monster grasp. Thank you for joining me. That story was The Weeds in my installment for Distant Torments. To follow, please go to distanttorments.bsky.social, so that's Blue Sky, and my blog is distanttorments.blogspot.com if you want to see the full printed story. Thank you.